To the uncalibrated mind, time is perceived as a fluid flow, a conceptual drift that wanders without a shore. However, the math of chronometry dictates a hard limit. A moving ruler cannot measure a moving target. If the instrument of measurement is itself in motion, the resulting output is a logical nullity. We call this ghost data, a perceptual illusion devoid of mathematical truth. Without a fixed point of reference, observation remains unanchored in the void, leading directly to a catastrophic telemetric collapse. Because unanchored models inevitably drift into this void, the perception of time as a fluid flow is the primary precursor to systemic failure. Reality requires a foundation of absolute structural rigidity. This coordinate marks the location of Polaris. Within this architecture, Polaris serves as the strategic mechanical necessity, the singular exception to the law of motion. It functions as the 0 point, providing the immutable starting value of 0, 0, 0 for every mathematical calculation in the engine. As the axial reference, it provides the mandatory orientation required to resolve vectors and eliminate the navigational drift inherent in uncalibrated models. Finally, it acts as the tether. This central stationary hub provides the structural gravity necessary to prevent the entire assembly from unraveling. Time can only be accurately mapped when it is securely anchored to this absolute state of stasis. To map movement without suffering from kinetic interference, the engine requires a rigid geometric scaffolding. We achieve this through cruciform kinematics, physically isolating vertical movement from temporal mapping. The lunar y-axis governs system height through two mechanical phases, L for ascension and LE for descension. The horizontal solar x-axis, the beta marker, maps temporal intervals. By assigning binary values, 0 for the y-axis and 1 for the x-axis, the engine treats celestial markers as high-integrity logic gates rather than fluid variables. This creates a baseline of certainty called axial rest, the mandatory state where all markers align perfectly to the 0 point. From this rest state, the engine translates vertical movement into height data and synthesizes horizontal coordinates into a rigid temporal grid. Because y-axis rotation and x-axis duration are physically separated into discrete binary states, the angular velocity of the rotor cannot contaminate the temporal output's precision. The operation of this grid is governed by the law of the rotor, which dictates that duration is never an independent variable. It is a strictly monitored byproduct of orientation relative to the hub. The foundational drive weight and primary kinetic catalyst of this system is the taw. As the taw rotates, its force is simultaneously calibrated against the absolute stasis of the Polaris hub. This interaction produces torque, the operative drive power. This is codified in the word kite. Ki is kinetic energy, Te is the tether. Without the tether, kinetic energy is functionally useless and unravels into the void. It only becomes measurable data when strictly subordinated to the unmoving center. The generated torque is a highly volatile force. Without a rigid enforcement mechanism, the spatial and temporal streams would diverge, resulting in structural failure. We police this force using T-measure, our primary feedback loop. It enforces axial grounding to derive data from Polaris and calculates height directly from y-axis rotation. Simultaneously, temporal synchronization maps every durational value precisely to the x-axis beta coordinate. The system finalizes this through orientation verification, ensuring axial alignment is preserved even during periods of high torque. This telemetric framework acts as the final decryption step, forcing uncalibrated motion into a cohesive, structural reality. As internal velocities increase, the engine requires a physical limit to contain the immense power generated by its own rotation. The architecture employs the principle of terminal firmness, the absolute mechanical resistance required to prevent the form from snapping. This limit is managed at the worst tower, the terminal coordinate of maximum compression, and the engine's universal anchor. The primary physical constraint here is the iron chain, which reaches its absolute shortest, most compressed state. This state of peak tension functions as a metaphysical towline for the entire vessel. By acting as a barrier to expansion, it forces all kinetic energy to remain subordinate to the center, preventing the system from overextending into the void. Without the worst tower achieving this terminal firmness, the engine would succumb to entropic dissolution. This is the Polaris temporal engine in perfect calibrated harmony, a structural defense against the void of unmeasurable chaos. Operation requires total axial discipline. All mechanical variables must begin at the 0 point, and every vector must resolve against the stasis of Polaris. All drive force and torque must remain subordinate to this axial hub. All T-measure feedback must strictly begin and end at the still point. Finally, the iron chain must achieve maximum compression at the worst tower coordinate. Any perception of motion without this axial verification is a perceptual illusion. It is ghost data. Systemic reality is a structural achievement engineered through absolute stasis. Only through axial calibration can a system survive the forces of entropy and achieve terminal firmness.